This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. This show deals with living the Catholic faith in our time, discovering God's presence in our lives, and finding hope in His Word. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Monsignor Don Wolf, rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. We approach the anniversary of the Martyrdom of Blessed Stanley Rother, which causes us to recall that it was about 1 o'clock in the morning on July the 28th, 1981, when 3 men entered the rectory of St. James Parish on Lago Atitlán in Guatemala, that is, Santiago Atitlán. They were searching for the pastor. They were members of a death squad sent to kidnap the priest there and bring him out of the house and into custody. As they crept through the residence in the early morning hour, they were enacting a familiar pattern of behavior that had been practiced throughout this highland village over the previous years. They were at work to silence the voice of the one who spoke in the name of the people there. By stifling him, the work of maintaining order and quieting change could continue. Going up the stairs, they were ascending toward the goal that had sent them there. Upstairs was the bedroom of the pastor. No one knows exactly who these men were. As was the common practice of the time, there was a great deal of uncertainty when it came to the behavior of the armed forces there. In the village, there was not an overwhelming police presence. Guatemala is a poor country, and the village of St. James was the very poorest place in that locale. Social services, including those that maintain common civil order, were in short supply. The police weren't exactly local, but they were known there and not known to be especially cruel or intrusive. And these men were not the police. At the same time, the Guatemalan army had occupied the village for more than 2 years. They were there to be a bulwark against the insurgency going on in the countryside, backing up the policies of the ruling government, who had promised to maintain the status quo amid the cries for change surging up from the people. The soldiers had imposed martial law, and they'd cracked down hard on the movement of the population. They made it difficult to walk the streets and alleys of the town, making it a crime to be out after dark without permission or an approved purpose. Both day and night, armed patrols moved through the village, making sure nothing untoward or unspecified was happening. During the time of their presence, the common practices of counterinsurgency were also put in place. There were kidnapping and sequestration, rough questioning, hard interrogations. They were military men, and they were concerned to provide military solutions to the societal problems looming through the country at the time. Many of those who'd been taken when the military were on watch had been tortured, many of them tortured to death. A man taken off the street by uniformed soldiers would disappear from his family, not to be heard of for days. Later, his body would be recovered, many times shredded by torture and abuse. There'd be no explanation of what had happened or what the succession of events were. All over Latin America, this type of military occupation had become increasingly popular. Along with it came a category of people referred to in Spanish as los desaparecidos, the disappeared. This is the noun version of the reflexive verb desaparecerse, which not only means to disappear, but has the form in which there is no cause for the action. It's a passive construction, an action with no one designated to cause it. It's in the same category as the reflexive verb caerse, which means to fall. In its form, one can say se cayó, which means when referring to something that fell down, that it simply fell. There was no cause we know of. It just fell down. The desaparecidos simply disappeared. No one knew how or why or by whom exactly. It also allowed for someone to say that a person was disappeared, but again, without indicating how or by whom. Throughout the tough times of the 70s and 80s, all through the streets and jungles and mountains of Latin America, there were a great number of the disappeared whose names were mounting on the lists being kept throughout the continent. There was no question the soldiers and their commanders occupying this highland village in Guatemala were coincident with the disappearances, marking the history of that place and time. As the pastor had noted to the colonel commanding the outpost, kidnapping, torture, and murder hadn't been factors in the lives of the villagers until the soldiers had come. This didn't endear him to the commander, but it was a truth everyone there knew. He was the one to say it out loud. The apparatus of the army was present in order to carry out the strategy of pacifying the unrest in the village, which meant searching out and extinguishing anyone who is not in line with governmental policy, of removing those who had an agenda for the future of the people there different than the agenda approved by the powers that were. They were there, the military, to impose order. Yet it would probably not be sufficient to point to the army and its commander as the one who was in charge of the order imposed there. In the politics of the day, there were many levels of concern and many layers of response to what was going on in the country. One colonel was not sufficient to make policy with regard to the treatment of people, nor was he the one who was simply left to make the tactics and practices of the moment fruitful. Behind his leadership and scrutiny were other commanders and other layers of responsibility and levels of authority that climbed all the way to the national defense sector in the capital and on to the highest levels of the civil administration. Santiago Atitlán was a blip on the map of the country, but it wasn't just a dot in the minds and administrations of those who were running the country. This out-of-the-way place in the Mayan highlands, forgotten for centuries, and most noted for its poverty and the intractable hillbilly notions of its people, had become transfixed by the peculiarities of the Cold War. The preoccupations of the superpowers collided there as they vied with each other for control in the politics of the day and of their impact among the people of this Central American country. Guatemala had no great oil reserves. It was not noted for its minerals or its mines. It had nothing that anyone much wanted, except perhaps an alternative source for orchids, bananas, and blankets. It had nothing of outstanding value except its location, square in the center of the geography of Central America. There, it became a place where it can influence what happened among its neighbors, the principals of which were Mexico and El Salvador. The first rules of real estate applied to this place, noted mostly for its poverty and its picaresque landscapes. Location, location, location doomed it to the attention of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. With the surprise fall of the Somoza government in Nicaragua in 1979, the administration in Washington went into overdrive. Realizing the strategic impact of governments not aligned to the politics of the U.S., every government in Central America became a focus of funding and military attention. It became the policy of Washington to buttress its position throughout the struggling nations to its south, so that there might not be an increased toehold of those who wished ill on the geostrategic position that the U.S. enjoyed there. And thus money and arms poured into Guatemala so as to shore up its struggle against those who advocated for revolution or who talked of change. Along with this influx came the attached concerns on the part of the Yankees who provided it. The lines of communication and authority running through the government of Guatemala were crowded with the concerns of those from the north, supplying the resources to achieve their purposes in the south. This jumble of concerns and reactions made it hard to know exactly where the decisions were being made and what those decisions entailed exactly. Perhaps it is the case that there never really are any straight lines when it comes to the politics of a place, any place, but it certainly was the case that at this time and in this country of Central America, the pathways of authority were not pristine or clear. When the death squad appeared in the moonlight, pouring onto the steps of the second floor of the rectory in Santiago, who sent them or what they represented was not perfectly clear. At least it wasn't the case with those who were not directly and immediately present. In truth, we don't know who for sure, if even those present, creeping upstairs themselves, knew exactly what was happening. More than 20 years ago, one of those who spoke most authoritatively about the night of the 28th explained that it was a common practice among those who organized these groups that the actual mission of the death squad was hidden even from those who took part. Specifically, it was said that petty criminals were formed into these groups and given the job of doing the dirty work of capture and murder. Then, later on, they were themselves murdered in turn by those who formed the group. In the deliberate confusions of the time, even the murderers were murdered to preserve the initiative and the options of those in charge. As they went up the steps, these men were part of the wheels within wheels machinery set in motion by who knows whom. Over the 45 years since this particular morning, nothing has become clearer about their motivations, about their identity, about their lines of authority, or about their mission. As they pushed through the darkness, they quickly came to the room where the pastor of the parish had made his quarters for the previous decade. The rectory was old, built more than 100 years before, and had solid masonry walls worthy of a bunker. That is, on the first floor it did. On the second floor, where the priests' quarters were, the walls were flimsier and more fragile, constructed of wood and wallboard, setting on the solid first floor walls as its foundation. Going down the hallway from the great room on the second floor, the squad quickly came to and then opened the rickety second door on the right and rushed in. Even in the moonlight, they knew they had been misled. They had made a mistake, because in the bed there was a man sleeping, but not the tall, bearded Anglo pastor. Instead, there was a young Guatemalan there, under the covers, obvious even in the dark. It turns out to have been the brother of the associate pastor. He'd taken refuge in the rectory, hoping to avoid the threat of kidnapping or assassination because of his connection to his priest brother. It turns out he made a poor choice. He was awakened with the barrel of a pistol at his temple and the command to show them where the priest is. This young man, Francisco, was dragged out of bed and sent to lead the small squad to the priest's door. There weren't that many options open to him or to them. The rectory was not a hut or a shanty, but neither was it a great mansion. Francisco led them to the only other option for the pastor's bedroom, which was downstairs. Odd to say in this narration, the pastor had anticipated this moment for a long time before. As early as 1980, he had spoken openly of the threat that loomed over this time, his time in the parish. A good number of his parishioners had already been taken by then. It was only obvious to presume that as the people of the parish were threatened, so he was as well. And he knew the configuration of the threat he faced. Over and over again he had said, "If they come for me, they'll never get me out of the house." Embedded in his comment was the truth that to be taken was a one-way trip. To be snatched out of his bed, to be hauled off in such a way, was to be tortured, almost certainly to death. Taken out of the rectory meant to be taken off to a painful and horrible end. At least his experience of recovering the bodies of those who had been disappeared had led him to the firm conclusion: to be apprehended was to be hauled off to execution. In this knowledge, he had made his decision. He would not be taken. This was not as straightforward a decision as it seems to us at our move. He was, after all, an American. He had every right to presume his passport would protect him from the vicissitudes of the wild politics in his adopted country. It was one thing to grab one of the poor parishioners off the street, whose identity as a local protected him not at all from the surrounding authorities. But it was certainly another to take an American citizen, an American priest, who represented an inbuilt constituency of people who cared for his protection and his mission. Moving against him would certainly result in the phone lines from Guatemala to the U.S. to heat up. Not to mention the phone lines that would in turn buzz in Washington, D.C. concerning his identity and his fate. Dragging an American, a Catholic priest, a missionary, out of his rectory into a torture cell in the corner of some army camp or in the basement of some jail would become international news eventually. Deciding to make this happen would be complicated for everyone in every respect. And the complications were added to by this priest's convictions. Not only had he decided not to be taken, he had decided to stay. As an American with a passport, he was free to drive to Guatemala City, buy a ticket, board a plane, and go anywhere. He could return to his hometown. He could sit on a beach in Mexico. He could enjoy the summer in Paris, visit his relatives in New York, or more simply, just be absent from the pressure cooker atmosphere that had heated up in his parish. And yet, he hadn't. He had decided to stay there and to guide his people best he could in complication and complexity. His convictions were expressed in a letter to his family and then later to his bishop and then finally to the diocesan newspaper. He wrote, "The shepherd does not run at the first sign of danger. or in his case, at the 33rd sign of danger. He had looked at the truth of his situation. He'd sized up what faced him. He intuited the stakes involved, and he evaluated what he could best do. He opted to remain in his parish and be the pastor they needed. He decided to stay. He knew that they would come for him. In his descriptions about his decision concerning his future, he had at least once changed his words. He took to saying, "When they come for me, they'll never get me out of the rectory." His future was in his hands, and so the stage was set. He would not be in charge of the inevitability of the history that would be made there, but he was resolute in what his part would be. He was staying. What would happen as a result of those who decided to respond to his decision was in their hands, not in his. And thus the men who appeared at his door in the moonlight of that early morning, in the mind of almost everyone, the situation in Guatemala and in the rest of Central America was bathed in the dark waters of evil. It was true that insurgency was in the air almost everywhere. By its nature, it was obscure and uncertain. Most of those who prompted it were indeed bent on revolution and overthrow. Many of them were committed to violent change at any cost, a formula for disorder and chaos that had tilted into turmoil and murder on near continental scale throughout the 20th century, all around the globe. No one knew, though, if there were only a few scattered platoons of committed adventurers, or in fact were hidden armies of militant soldiers. All was hidden. And the response was equally obscure. Death squads, international consultants, the spy agencies of half a dozen countries, politicians, NGOs, and just adventurers were all at work in their own spheres and in their own ways. Some wanted to be sure everything they did was documented and reported. In fact, they longed for the publicity and notice of the whole world. Others worked in deep background, providing advice and material to establish the resistance to those working against the government. Still others worked only in the dark, officially off the books and invisible to the official notice, and camouflaged from the view of those nominally in charge. And all these were woven into the great and grand part of the population who mostly wanted to just get on with their lives. These levels and in areas and groups were like computer chips. All the parts were functioning all at the same time, producing an output only remotely related to the input. At best, things were continually obscure. At worst, darkness enveloped everything. And yet, the struggle filled the inches of newspaper space week after week, both in the front pages and in the deep editorials. It was a struggle of ideas, of tactics and strategy, and of history, and they all seemed to be the oxygen that sustained Washington and Guatemala City and its leaders. That the deepest motivations and the crucial decisions were in secret and exercised in darkness was not new or different, but they all contributed to the indefiniteness of the environment that allowed evil to flourish. There's nothing unusual about how evil grows and prospers in our world. Every situation is filled with the indefiniteness necessitated by our human incompleteness. Our decisions are always the product of inference and intuition. They're never strictly logical or deductive. Living in the world is always tinged with the possibility of destruction and with the opportunity for grace. Striving to live in the light is always an option, but it's always constrained. Evil flourishes in this ambiance, especially when evil actions seem to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. And so it was in Guatemala during these days. Everyone knew there was agitation and revolution in the air, but nobody seemed to know who or how. Repression was everywhere as well, uniformed and explicit, but often untraceable and indefinite when it came to the most egregious examples, especially when the news was filled with stories of massacres and disappearances and killings. All was vaporous. Everything was layered and complicated. It wasn't an accident at that time that magical realism became the most commonly recognized Latin American literary form during these decades. Everyone was living in its bizarre narrative of spiritual realities and brutal responses, spoken from the dark buzz of benighted histories. But the pastor's insight pierced the veil of obscurantism. He knew the price of maintaining his presence among his people. Whether it offended Washington or was defended by it, whether he was a thorn in the side of the local commander or was the cornerstone of keeping the good order in the village, he knew his work was to accompany his people in the crisscross of politics. He remained so as to derail the bitterness of abandonment so that they could know his presence was not of convenience but of commitment. In the cloud of activity produced by the think tanks and strategy sessions in two countries, he understood his place. He chose to stay. He chose to anchor himself to the needs of the people he served. He chose to be a pastor. When the death squad reached his door, they were stopped somewhat short. Their quarry was behind the one sole oaken door at the entrance to his room. The walls of his sleeping quarters were thick masonry. There was just one way in and one way out. His flanks were secure, his defenses stout, but they still held the upper hand because they had their young prisoner. "Tell him there's a bomb in the house," they whispered. The young man who had been taken by them for just this moment said, "Father, they've come for you." And thus the moment crystallized from vaporous indefiniteness to solid certainty, just as its strategic placement demanded. Out of the darkness of the moment, from the scattered moonlight of misdirection and deniability, they had come for him. And they had to come to him, and they had to come at him, and they had to come at him face to face, which is what they did. They had in their power the young man they'd taken from his bed. Across the compound from the pastor's bedroom was a convent filled with the sisters who ministered in the parish, as well as 2 other visitors. Everyone was in danger of those who possessed the weapons and the murderous intent of this squad, whose only concern was to complete the mission they had been given. With the sum of these factors looming in the dark, such a specter haunting the options of the pastor, he unlocked the door and the squad rushed in. It didn't take long. The contest of 3 against 1 almost always goes to the sum of muscle and experience, no matter the fantasies of Hollywood, and it was this way with them. And in the history of the contest between firearms and flesh, flesh has always been the loser, and so it was on this night. But the pastor had thought this through as well. Being grounded in the truth, unaffected by the fantasies of abstract notions and hazy ideas, he knew from the beginning his life was forfeit. If they came for him, his life was over. Its only measure would be how it would end. And his determination was that it would end in the light, not in the dark. In all of the maneuvering of circumstance and location, they had to come to him, at him, face to face. As they did, the advantages of indefiniteness and unnamability were abandoned. They were not going to take him out of the house and into the darkness of disappearance. They had to deal with him and his pastoral presence there and then. As they came for him, he went for them and precipitated their reaction. They struggled until they shot him. It might have been a surprise to them that he fought them and how powerfully he did. It was not a surprise to him. He had been staring death in the face for the previous year. He knew the stakes of his staying. Now he was paying the price. In the struggle of men against this man, they shot 3 times, and then they walked away, out into the dark, returning to the place from where they came. Their mission apparently was over. But in a world in which all is connected, nothing is just over. St. Thomas Aquinas reminded his readers at the beginning of his Summa that all the world is full of signs, each communicating the truth of the world to the one who can read them. They are not obscure or mystical, as if the world were full of magic. They are instead an invitation to the fullness of life and meaning of which the world is suffused. Everyone can read them if he's willing to plumb the depths of truth, the world that the world is programmed to reveal. And so it was with this man's death. The pastor who died in the dark of the morning died so that the light of a new day might penetrate the night that had descended. While it was hard to know at the moment, this killing set off a cascade of reaction and realization that stretched across the territories of 2 countries and the story of its peoples. No one knows how much this pastor's deliberations had included these inevitabilities, but whether he knew what would happen or what its results would be, he did know his commitment to his people, including his willingness to confront the powers of evil. And the price to pay is always the same. It takes a life to penetrate the powers of death. His life did exactly this. Blessed Father Stanley Rother was martyred in the dark of the morning, July the 28th, 1981. Upon his death, the sisters from the next room rushed to his room. This visiting sister who worked with him ran to him, cradled him in her arms, although he was already dead. A Latin American pietà that had him duplicated hundreds of thousands of times by then. It wasn't until the coming of dawn that the news could escape, and when it did, the predictable responses poured in from Oklahoma City, from Washington, D.C., from Guatemala City, and from every street and canton in Santiago Atitlán. As it did, the curious inversion of the promise of the gospel of Jesus Christ began to percolate. The more the news spread, the more light it shed. The more we became aware of what had happened in the darkness, the more the dawning day revealed. In the light of Blessed Stanley Rother's life, we begin to see promises and potentials only hinted at the beginning. Evil thrives in darkness. It withers in the light. It costs this man his life, but in the price of his life, he purchased a statement of truth for all of us. Blessing comes even in death. And from that day to this, the graces he brought has not stopped. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called The Sad Girl. I've tried to remember the name of the sad girl in my geography class. She sat 2 seats in front, assigned by the impossession of alphabet fastness. But it wasn't the letter beginning her last name that prompted me, neither then nor now, to look and wonder at her proximity. It was the sad lines of her face, the grimness of how her hard jaw set, that made me notice she didn't have the freedom the carefree get, but instead kept to herself in everything and guarded herself from us all. Mom or dad absent, or worse, present, or was at home, endless fall into the hard ways of unrewarded struggle of all against each, so that she never had a moment when beauty or peace could teach. The days passed, and I never talked to her much, as there wasn't much to say. Now I wonder where in creation she's found herself and discerned her way. Mystery defines every moment in this complicated pathway we mount, and we leave behind more than we imagine, more than we can possibly count. That's the sad girl. As we prepare to celebrate this great feast day, hope that all of us can remember that it is a part of what it means to be living Catholic. Hope you can join us in the weeks to come.
Living Catholic is a production of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City for Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.